Shadowrun, a universe that takes its roots from Dungeons & Dragons and grows into its own by combining cyberpunk, urban fantasy, and a variety of other fiction genres. This universe was given birth to itself as a pen and paper role-playing game in the late 80s, and eventually, despite almost not happening, Shadowrun became a video game in 1993. From its pen and paper origins, and to its upcoming video game return in the form of Shadowrun Returns, this episode will get you up to speed on the series. Are you ready for another run, chummer? Shadowrun is a pen and paper role-playing game or tabletop role-playing game that was introduced in 1989. Borrowing elements from a large amount of different source material like Blade Runner and William Gibson's Sprawl trilogy of novels, Shadowrun gave those tired of the typical medieval Dungeons & Dragons scenario something futuristic to experience and expand upon. As the real world embraced technology more and more with electronic components and computers, Shadowrun seemed to be right in line with those wanting to act out their love for technology and what the possible future of it could be. As Shadowrun continued to gain popularity, it started to spawn its own series of books, starting with the first few in 1990. One of these books, released that year, Never Deal with a Dragon, would be the starting ground for what would eventually become the very first Shadowrun game. A few years later, Beam Software, an Australian-based video game developer, acquired the rights to develop the very first version of Shadowrun for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The game unfortunately had a rocky start to it, as the head developer left midway through the production of the game, causing it to get stalled altogether. Thankfully, Paul Kidd, who worked on Nightshade for the NES, was brought onto the Shadowrun project, and being familiar with the universe, was ready to finish the game in a very short period of time to meet with the deadline of getting the game released. So my first experience with Shadowrun was actually on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and how I found out about it was through an issue of Nintendo Power. I was a Nintendo Power kid, of course. In 1993, I believe it was the Batman Returns issue, I'm flipping through it, I read the Star Fox comic, and then shortly after that was a preview/review for Shadowrun. And what attracted me to it in the first place was the fact that it wasn't your standard RPG fare. It wasn't like your Lufia games or your Dragon Warrior games or Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy II, of course, was out by that point. It was different. It had a different perspective. The term cyberpunk was cool. It was an action-oriented RPG that had a cool conversation system. It was just something very unique for its time. It wasn't like anything else, so of course I was instantly attracted to it. But the problem was getting a hold of it after checking out this review. I can't recall at any point in time seeing a retail boxed copy of this game in anywhere in my local area in Illinois when this game came out. Not Best Buy, Kmart, Walmart, anything like that. I never saw it. And the local video store by us did not have it, and that's where we got all our games from. So if that video store didn't get it, we were pretty much done. At this point, there was a video game chain open. They had 2 local stores, and strictly what they did was rent video games, and they sold used games. So we went to this place, we checked it out, signed up for their program, and sitting there on the shelf among many awesome games that our local video store didn't have was Shadowrun. And of course, as soon as I saw it, I told my dad, we have to play this thing. Can we rent this? And so we did. So we get inside, power up the SNES, start the game up, we get that awesome introduction, kind of setting the back tone for the story and everything, at least the main story of Shadowrun. You hit start and what the hell? You wake up in a morgue. There hasn't been too many games that have done that. Maybe the only other game I can think of that's kind of similar would be Blood, when you actually rise from your tomb, but this was totally different from anything I ever played, and you're trying to solve this mystery of who you are and why this gang out of nowhere tried to kill you, and it's very engrossing. Opening the door, you scare the hell out of the people running the morgue, you run outside and get out of the morgue, and this guy runs up to you and says, dude, you got shot to hell, there's no way you should be alive. And that introduces you to the conversation system that Shadowrun had. And how it worked was you could either exit, you could talk, or you could ask about. And usually every time you talk to somebody, you would get a new word in kind of a bold white, and that would be a new keyword. And then you could ask about that certain keyword. So as you're going through the game, you're building an entire list of different keywords, and not everyone's going to have an answer to everything, and they give you a generic statement to what that is if you ask it, but it paid to ask everybody almost everything because you never knew what kind of secret they had. If you asked about the keyword negotiations, you could learn how to negotiate with people, buy that skill, build that skill, and then hiring other Shadowrunners were cheaper. It was just a really unique play on a game that no one really saw on a console at the time. Shadowrun was one of those rental games that you had to rent a couple of times in order to beat. Like I said, there were a lot of things you had to do to get keywords and ask these certain keywords with certain people to advance the plot. The other thing was you had to use your hand icon to search the areas thoroughly. If you didn't, there were a lot of opportunities for missing stuff. And if you missed this stuff, you could not advance the game very far. The earliest example of that in the game is there are two items that you need to advance the plot. And they are a scalpel as well as a slap patch. And both can be found in the morgue. But because the graphics can be very small in this game, they don't really stand out to you. So what you got to do is open the fridge, get the bandage, go to the surgery table or the autopsy table, get the knife, and then shortly later in the game, you actually go into a cemetery and you use the knife to break open the doors. And when you get into the doors to these tombs, you actually find a guy who is injured. Well, you use the slap patch and he gives you an item that lets you advance things further into the game. But they're very easy to miss for first-time players, and that was a part I was stuck on for a decent amount of time. Was for the simple fact that I didn't know these items were there. So you really do have to pay attention to it, and that's probably one of the biggest flaws of the SNES version of Shadowrun. So the video store we rented that game from went out of business. Its neighboring store went out of business, and that was the last time we would ever see Shadowrun again for a very long time. And I'm glad we rented it so many times because we were able to beat it, my little brother and I. But it has one of the most disappointing things in the ending, and it's not a plot thing. It's something that basically says outright, you're gonna have further adventures in Shadowrun 2. So of course, me and my little brother look at each other as soon as we see this statement and we go apeshit because yeah, we wanted another Shadowrun. This was amazing. And unfortunately, Shadowrun 2 never materialized, and I don't even know if it ever reached as far as development for it. And I don't know if that was due to a lack of interest or because Data East, the makers of the games, or at least the publishers, had a lot of issues from all the different years of stuff. I mean, that's a whole nother episode. The Super Nintendo version of Shadowrun was given positive reviews and called a game ahead of its time when it was released. Unfortunately, it was a commercial failure, supposedly due to low shipping numbers. This, along with the fact that the original game had a troubled internal development cycle, and the fact that the new project lead wasn't particularly liked during his takeover of the game, is what most likely led Beam Software to never develop a sequel. Shadowrun would return to a video game console a year later in 1994 when a California-based company called Blue Sky Software developed its own take on the Shadowrun universe for the Sega Genesis. The game featured distinctive differences from the SNES version and would draw an eventual line between fans as to which version was better, the Super Nintendo version or the Genesis version.
Schattenlaub. Schattenlaub.
I was a comic book kid in the 90s, and by being a comic book kid, you saw a lot of advertisements either in the middle of the comic or at the very end, and in the back of it was an advertisement for the Sega Genesis version of Shadowrun. And it intrigued me instantly again because it was Shadowrun, but there was something weird about it. It didn't follow the same lines of the Shadowrun on the Super Nintendo system. It was top-down. The cyberspace jumps seem a little bit different, but nevertheless it was a cool looking Shadowrun game that I wanted to check out. Only problem was, didn't have a Sega Genesis, so probably months down the line I make a swap with one of my dad's friends just to temporarily switch out my Super Nintendo so he can try some of the games on that, and he lets me borrow his Sega Genesis. So we hit the rental store with fury, man. And they happened to have, they never had the Super Nintendo version of it, but they had the Sega Genesis version of Shadowrun. And we rented it, and again on the ride home, I'm checking through the manual, and for whatever reason, I'm slightly intrigued, but this thing isn't attracting me as much as the Super Nintendo version of Shadowrun did. So we come home, pop the game into the Sega Genesis, turn it on, you got the cool cyberspace guy coming up and blasting the Sega logo, he disappears, you start the game up, you get the intro, you get the gist of the story of what's going on, it's a revenge story, and the game starts up and you're in this really dark, gritty area, and you walk into the bar and you're introduced to the conversation system that is in the Sega Genesis version of this. And to me, it's not really as intuitive or memorable as the Super Nintendo version of it. I think if you were a fan of the pen and paper version of Shadowrun, then you would probably lead more towards playing the Genesis version, just because the terminology and the environments and the people you encounter are tied more to what they would actually do in the Shadowrun pen and paper game on the Sega Genesis version compared to what they would on the Super Nintendo version. And you of course have to play the pen and paper games to know that, and I didn't play those till way later in my life, so that may be another reason why I wasn't really into the Sega Genesis version of Shadowrun. Coming back to the Sega Genesis version of Shadowrun now, I did so last week. My opinion of it isn't as hated as it was when I played it when I was a kid. I do appreciate the game. I still think it's dark as hell. It doesn't matter what kind of TV you're playing on. It's just a very dark looking game. But now that I've played the pen and paper RPG versions of Shadowrun, I did appreciate the terminology that was used. The plot is unique. The game just seems very rushed to me. It just doesn't seem like they put a lot of emphasis on different areas and making each area unique to itself. It just feels very cut and paste to me. But it's not a bad game. I appreciate the game. It just doesn't hold a candle to the Super NES version of Shadowrun. But hey, I know there's people who feel the exact same way comparing the Super Nintendo version of Shadowrun to the Sega Genesis version. Like I said, there's people on both sides of the fence. There's nothing wrong with whatever version you like, but I'm the Super Nintendo guy. That's all I can say. While the majority of the world would experience only 2 Shadowrun games on 16-bit consoles, Japan exclusively got a completely new version of the game on the Mega CD, otherwise known to North American fans as the Sega CD. The game was based on the Japanese Shadowrun manga and took place in Japan. Coincidentally, it was also the last Mega/Sega CD game created. Due to how text-heavy the game wasn't very high on the list of gamers who wanted to import it due to the language barrier. It would be almost 13 years before Shadowrun would hit again in the form of a video game, and it did so in 2007 on the Xbox 360 and PC. The return of the Shadowrun would be met with much disappointment, however, as rather than staying with its RPG roots for gameplay like its previous console titles, this version took Shadowrun to a new genre in the form of a first-person shooter. So Shadowrun did get introduced to us on current consoles, and that was in the form of Shadowrun on the Xbox 360 and PC. There were a lot of fans of the pen and paper RPG and a lot of fans of the Super Nintendo and Genesis games wondering what this was going to be. And when it finally came out, it was a Counter-Strike game in the Shadowrun universe. And I think the issue was with the game wasn't so much that it was a bad game, because it's still being played today. It's just not the Shadowrun game that the mass majority of players and followers of Shadowrun wanted. They wanted something that was going to be like the pen and paper game or the Super Nintendo game or the Sega Genesis game, and instead they got a first-person shooter that used a lot of cool assets from the Shadowrun universe, but it wasn't in the way that they wanted to do it. Finally, after years of waiting, Shadowrun fans may finally have a version of Shadowrun that captures the universe and fun that the SNES and Genesis versions of the game provided them. This comes in the form of Harebrained Schemes' Shadowrun Returns. Due out July 25th, 2013, this fan-funded game has much anticipation for it. So last year, the Kickstarter craze really started, in my opinion, at least in the video game terms of things. You know, Double Fine did their thing, they got their project backed, and then Harebrained Schemes comes out and announces Shadowrun Returns and that they're doing a Kickstarter for it. Sitting there, getting to the website and watching the developers talk about what kind of game they would like to make out of the Shadowrun universe really tied true with at least the Super Nintendo version of the game, the Sega Genesis version, and the pen and paper RPG. I get the feeling that Harebrained Schemes knows why fans love those original games to begin with and why they love the pen and paper RPG. And we'll find out in the next couple of days, but I think we are probably going to be at the closest aspect of getting something that is really a true enjoyable sequel to the SNES and Sega Genesis versions of Shadowrun than anything else before. And I hope that's the case. I've seen some videos out there. Someone's remaking the Super NES version of Shadowrun with all the different assets that Shadowrun Returns has. And that's awesome. It shows that there are a lot of customizable things in Shadowrun Returns. Now, whether or not it turns out to be a good game or not, well, that's to be seen. But right now, I haven't felt this much anticipation for a Shadowrun game since opening up that issue of Nintendo Power magazine back in 1993 and seeing Shadowrun for the Super NES for the first time. So hopefully that remains true for this new one for Shadowrun Returns.